A biblical perspective on life, culture and current events. This is 2020 on Vision.
As we do on a Monday, we like to check in with the Australian Christian Lobby and note some of those things that are happening on the political agenda. Ashlyn Weiss is the Australian Christian Lobby State Director for South Australia. Ashlyn, a special welcome back to 2020.
Thank you very much, Neil.
Ashlyn, let's start with something national and then we'll get a zeroing in focus on South Australia. Latest polling, when we're talking about federal politics, the coalition ahead of Labor in the polls for the first time since the last election. I wonder if you've got any thoughts here. Is that significant?
Polls are always an interesting game, but I noticed that just came out this morning. And as you mentioned, it is the first time since the last election that the coalition has topped the charts in the polling. A really interesting comment that's come out in people analysing this poll is that there is increasingly a preference for minor pies, and this has been trickling up to the Liberals. And there's been a 1 point drop in primary support for the Greens, which from our perspective is a very good thing. As you know, the Greens push a very radical agenda now and have really gone far beyond their original, mission to support the environment, and they have radical agendas to push very progressive social ideals, decriminalisation of drugs. We know here in South Australia they've been working hard to liberalise prostitution and other such things. So look, it's an interesting analysis. We don't know exactly when the federal election is going to be called, but I'll be watching closely.
Interesting, isn't it, that everyone says the only poll that counts is the one that happens on election day. But there is some suggestion that maybe Labor could be a little nervous as those numbers continue to droop. Any thoughts from you there? I mean, is it best if we've got a close race in the lead up to an election?
Yeah, look, I think what Australians are feeling right now more than anything else is cost of living. When people aren't satisfied with their ability to just get by day to day, to buy a house, really important things like this, they're probably going to turn to whoever is not currently in government. And maybe that's a factor in this as well, I don't doubt. But it is still very, very tight, and I don't think this is going to be necessarily predictive of the outcome. But we'll see. I think it will be a tight race.
One of those things that captivates people who are interested in federal politics when those sorts of detail come out in polls. Hey, let's get a focus on what's happening in your backyard in South Australia, because there's something pretty significant coming up this Wednesday. Ben Hood and an amendment to the Termination of Pregnancy Act. What's happening in your backyard and why is this so important?
Yes, Neil. So just for people who aren't aware, in 2021, South Australia liberalised abortion and made it accessible right up until full-term gestation, which means essentially the day before a baby is born or due to be born, the mother can decide to terminate that pregnancy. Now, in the third trimester of pregnancy, which is after 27 weeks and 6 days, the process involved is feticide, which is a very awful procedure, but it involves injecting the baby with potassium chloride to cause cardiac arrest, and then inducing labour through labour-inducing drugs in the mother. A very traumatic process for the mother, might I add. Now, at that stage in pregnancy, babies have a 96% chance of surviving outside of the womb if they're not injected first with this potassium chloride. And so what Ben Hood is seeking to do by introducing this amendment is simply requiring that at that stage in pregnancy, rather than killing the child first, we simply go ahead with the labour-inducing drugs if the mother insists on not continuing with the pregnancy, and allow that baby to be born alive, and then the mother will have the option of adopting that child out if she doesn't wish to care for it. So from my perspective, this is a very conservative and sensible bill. I really think it's not radical at all, but a really important thing to be pushing for. It's given us an opportunity to shed a light on what's really going on in terms of late-term abortion in our hospitals. And yeah, I mean, I always say this is pro-woman, this is pro-baby, and it will save a few lives here in South Australia.
I mean, so many people, they just can't believe that we even have laws in Australia, abortion right up until birth. And in most of our jurisdictions, states and territories, that law is already in place. And so in South Australia, this sounds to me like it could be the possibility of a breakthrough. And if something happens in South Australia, no doubt it could be, a flow-on effect to other states. Is that why getting this particular amendment through on Wednesday would be so important? It could be the start of something good?
Absolutely. And I mean, people say that people have been calling this bill a forced births bill. I mean, nothing could be further from the truth, and something people often don't quite understand when it comes to late-term abortions is that the mother does have to somehow expel the baby, and so she does have to give birth anyway. And so I think we have really strong arguments on our side for introducing this legislation. As you mentioned, Neil, we have wall-to-wall abortion till birth in Australia, but the average Australian doesn't really know that, nor do they know what that truly entails. And so, I think this is really significant. Our understanding is it is a world first bill. We haven't seen a bill quite like it introduced anywhere else. But it's from our perspective, it's also about taking South Australians on a journey and, first of all, dealing with the most extreme consequences. I mean, ACL would love to see, and I would love to see, an Australia where abortion is unthinkable at any stage in pregnancy. But if we can deal with the most extreme consequences first, reality is abortion is not going to be outlawed anytime in the foreseeable future, but we do believe it is possible one day.
So, Ashlyn, for these mothers, instead of going right up to late term and then basically aborting, killing the baby could be induced, as I understand it, after 27 weeks and 6 days, instead of getting an abortion. Some might be saying, what happens to the baby? I mean, we're talking about babies here. What happens to the baby? Because clearly, as you say, it'd be great if it was just unthinkable, but these mothers don't want their child. Any thoughts about what happens, or is there suggestions in the amendment about what happens to the babies?
The idea behind this bill is that those babies would be put up for adoption. And the reason for that is that the foster care system, the aim of the foster care system is to reunite the families. My understanding is this bill itself doesn't put any requirements per se for adoption, but that is the purpose and the intention. And so, I mean, adoption is somewhat rare here in South Australia, so we're looking at ways as ACL as well to see how can we support that to become more accessible and easier, because there are so many South Australian couples that would love to adopt a child and have that sense of permanency. But when we are listening to arguments that this is putting the child in a difficult position, we just have to, really think that the alternative is that they were going to be killed. And so we're giving them a chance at a life. And as far as possible, we will advocate for those children to be cared for well. And I do believe there are many families ready and willing and able to do that.
We'll often have a program where callers will call in and say, what about adoption? Why isn't that happening more often? So this clearly, with abortion of late-term babies, is happening more often than any of us would like to think. I'm sure there are a lot of people who say, well, this must be such a rarity. It just doesn't happen much. But so far as I understand, in South Australia, something like 45 babies were aborted in that late term over an 18-month period. That's a huge number, isn't it?
Yeah, it's 45 babies since mid-2022. So our current Termination of Pregnancy Act came into effect in July 2022. So in that period of time, 45 babies have been subjected to feticide when they were viable, which means they could have been born alive and supported to stay alive at that age. And 37 of those were due to mental health reasons of the mother, which is interpreted quite broadly in current medical practice. And the thing to understand, Neil, as well, is that this particular procedure, feticide, is actually never medically necessary to save the mother's life. In rare instances where the mother's life is actually in danger, they will conduct an emergency C-section instead of this procedure.
So really, technically speaking, the child has no rights in the mother's womb, but this actually then creates, in some sense, a right because, or at least as Ben Hood says, something about balancing the choice of mother and child's rights. Is that being received? Do people understand that sort of balance, that there is a right for a child here?
Yeah, I mean, we want, we're talking about babies that at this age, you know, they grimace when their mother eats kale, they smile when their mum eats carrot because it's sweet. These are fully formed, developed and healthy babies, and they absolutely deserve human rights just as you or I. Human rights ought not to depend on our age or our stage of development, and so that's exactly right. They will have human rights to live through this bill, and Ben Hood is using the language of balancing that against, I suppose, the mother who may not wish to proceed with the pregnancy.
So for people who are thinking, what can I do for South Australians this week? Now, this Wednesday is when this amendment is being presented. There's some meetings. There's a big rally tomorrow. What would you be encouraging South Australians to get involved in, even in these next couple of days?
So tomorrow, Neil, which is Tuesday, we have a rally from 5:30 to 6:30 p.m. on the steps of Parliament. We recently had one supporting this very bill just a couple of weeks ago, and we got a turnout of around 2,000 South Australians, which was fantastic to see. We're doing another one, and this is the night before the expected vote. And the reason for that is really just to give that final plug, that final push of support to really communicate to the members of our upper house who will be voting on it first, that this is something South Australians want. This is something South Australians care about, and this will be a voting issue. So we're doing that with Dr. Joanna Howe, who has been coordinating this rally. And so I'll just strongly encourage anyone listening to this who does live in South Australia to take a look at her website or our socials. We've been promoting this rally. Come along. It really is a numbers game, and it makes a difference to show your support.
Okay, that rally is tomorrow night on the steps of the South Australian Parliament, 5:30 p.m. to 6:30. Considered to be a sensible bill to prevent extreme late-term abortion consequences. Pro-woman, pro-child. And your presence will count. Make that a priority, and perhaps even be prayerful about how that goes when it is debated in Parliament on Wednesday. Let's talk about another South Australian issue, and we've talked about this before, exit strategies for women who are trapped in prostitution. What's the latest, and where are things at in South Australia right now?
Yeah, thanks, Neil. So Nicola Centofanti, who is also a Liberal member in our upper house, has for a long time been pushing for reform in prostitution law in South Australia. And what she's pushed for is what's traditionally known as the Nordic model. We've been calling it the equality model here in South Australia, and she brought that to a vote earlier this year. Unfortunately, it failed by one vote in our upper house. Now, what that bill would have achieved is it would have criminalised the purchase of commercial sex to target demand. It would have strengthened criminalisation on pimping and other things linked with managing prostitution and promoting it. But it would have decriminalised the selling of sex and instead introduced supports for people who are caught in prostitution to exit that industry, recognising that many of them are subject to exploitation, are not very easily able to leave that industry. Now, off the back of that failing by one vote, Nicola pushed on and decided to just introduce the exit strategies aspect of her bill in a separate bill. And so that's what we call the exit strategies legislation. And that would have simply introduced a requirement for the government to offer supports to anyone who applied for assistance to exit the sex industry. Now, that support could have been things like housing assistance, job upskilling, access to legal or health services and things like that. So it was really disappointing to see that also be voted down in a vote of 8-11 in our upper house a couple of weeks ago. Now, the fight isn't over for us, and I know it isn't for Nicola either, and she's thinking about ways to continue trying to bring to light the harms of prostitution in South Australia and what can be done to help these women. But in the meantime, I really think the government is trying to keep controversial issues out of the lower house, and that's why we saw it voted down in the upper house a couple of weeks ago, unfortunately.
Just quickly on this, the thought that so many people seem to have about prostitution is that women think it's a fun career, just to use that sort of terminology in there. But women who are in prostitution, and you might have your own thoughts on this, but oftentimes trapped, or they come from very disadvantaged backgrounds, childhood abuse, drug addiction, all sorts of things, domestic violence. What are your thoughts here for the way that people, and including the Christian community, might be thinking about just how serious prostitution is and how reform is necessary?
Yeah, it's really heartbreaking to see it be promoted as normalised a lot in the media by what is a very small group of people dedicated to liberalising the industry and wanting to see it become more profitable. I think we're reaching a point in the sexual revolution happened in the 60s, and some of the pioneers of that really believed in this idea that sex itself can never be harmful. It's only the stigma and the man-made morals that we've invented around it that might make it harmful, and therefore things like prostitution can be truly empowering for women. It's just not true. It's not the way God designed us or created us. And I did ministry with women in prostitution for about 4 years. And so I've seen this firsthand, that the majority of women who find themselves in this situation are not there by true choice. They don't want that life. They're experiencing a lot of difficulty in getting by, and are often subject to various forms of exploitation and abuse within that industry. Something to understand as well is a lot of women that do end up in this industry have a history of sexual abuse and are financially desperate. So you don't really see very many women choosing this out of a plethora of options. So I'd like that to be communicated much more clearly in our public discourse.
Well, there are some significant developments that are happening in South Australia, and to find out more, to read about some of these sorts of developments, you'll find all sorts of good resource and articles and update detail on the Australian Christian Lobby website, acl.org.au, and that's how you can connect with Ashlyn Weiss. Ashlyn is the Australian Christian Lobby State Director for South Australia. acl.org.au. Ashlyn, thanks so much for another great update today on 2020.
Thank you, Neil.
Thanks for taking time to listen to this audio on demand from Vision Christian Media. To find out more about us, go to vision.org.au.